I had great pleasure to welcome our first speaker. Dr. Llwyd is the General Secretary of Cytun, Churches Together in Wales. He completed his doctorate in Cardiff University under the supervision of Professor Eifion James. And of course, Wyn is responsible for organising this series. And Gofal and Gwyntan wouldn't have existed without his, so we're very grateful to him. Cynan is also grateful, and we're grateful that he's supervised his thesis. The title of the thesis was the millennialism in the work of some of the Puritans of Wales and their social implications. And Cynan is interested in the field of religion in Wales, particularly theology in public life of Wales, which puts him in a particularly good situation to be General Secretary of Cytun. And Cynan, of course, works closely on ecumenical issues, and it's very appropriate that we welcome him. As the Week for Christian Unity comes to an end, Cynan also writes novels for young people. He lives in Llwyd or Grangetown in Cardiff with Rachel, his wife, and his sons, Seth and Evan. He's also one of the leaders of Grangetown, which is the Welsh church and is part of the Union of Congregationalists. He will address us today on the theme, the vision of a Cenhadwr Eglwysig and the Church Missionary Society. We're delighted to have you with us, Cynan. Very warm welcome. And I transfer over to you now. Excellent. Thank you very much, Ainsley. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be in your company, and thank you for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that you can see it. Everybody can see this? Yeah? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay,
well, good morning.
Yeah, bore da I chi gyd.
The vision of a Cenhadwr Eglwysig and the Church Missionary Society. One James asked me to introduce a paper on the Cenhadwr Eglwysig. Why did you do this? Oh, it's a question I asked myself. But after receiving the invitation, and I was very grateful for this, not because I had any particular information or insight on Cenhadwr Eglwysig itself, but because through my research for my doctorate, I developed an interest in the missionary movement, particularly the ideology behind which drove the missionary movement. I detailed the period of the Puritans. For the years around 1650 was my doctorate, but I enjoyed researching the growth of the missionary society from that period up to the beginning of the 20th century, really. And one of the organizations established in that period was the Church Missionary Society that was established in 1799. So this society was established in that year, and naturally enough, it became one of the most influential missionary organizations in the 19th century. It played a central role in disseminating Christianity around the world. This was a period of religious regeneration, social reform, and of course, the growth of the British Empire. And some of the forces which drove the establishment of the CMS was the evangelical movement within the Anglican Church and their desire to disseminate Christianity throughout the world. During the 18th century, Wales and England faced a period of considerable religious change. On the one hand, the number of worshippers declined. Clerics were often criticized for being unprincipled, uncaring, and unable to preach. But on the other hand, there was an evangelical revival led by people such as George Whitfield and the Wesley brothers in England, and of course Pantycelyn, Daniel Rowland and Hywel Harris in Wales, calling for a return to personal spirituality, preaching and missionary work. The evangelical movement emphasized personal conversion, the need for personal evangelization, and disseminating the gospel across the world, and a social mission as well. And this was based on biblical truth and mission. In that context, missionary work was seen as a spiritual duty, but also a means of reaching out in Christian love. The evangelicals were worried about the lack of mission amongst the people who were not Christian abroad and at home. And they saw mission as a key part of the way of disseminating the gospel. The establishment of the CMS, it was a direct response to these exact concerns. Although there was a lot of missionary work in the 18th century, many Christians felt that the Anglican Church didn't do enough to respond to the biblical call of disseminating Christianity. And it was a group of evangelicals within the church, the Clapham sect, led by the rector of Clapham, John Venn, and people such as William Wilberforce, tackled this and established a missionary society, the CMS, in 1799. The social and practical context were also important. During the 18th and the 19th century, as I mentioned already, the British Empire was expanding at a fast rate, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the islands of the Pacific. And as the empire expanded, so also the desire to spread the gospel. And it was easier to do so with centers the world over, so where the missionaries could land. And in this context, the Cenhadwr Eglwysig appeared under the sponsorship of the CMS. The editor of Cenhadwr Eglwysig was the Edmund Jones of Llanarmon Mynydd Mawr, a parish in the community of Llanrhaeadr y Mochnant in Montgomeryshire, when William Morgan, of course, was rector there in past century. As regards the magazine itself, from what I can see, it appeared from June 1853 and October 1854, or at least those are the issues available on the Cylchgronau Cymru website in the National Library. I've also mentioned the context of establishing the CMS. The success of missionary work in Wales and England, in Wales under people, these people, Daniel Rowland, Hywel Harris and William in the 18th century, and then people like Thomas Charles, Christmas Evans and so on, created an optimistic world. The success at home was a precursor of success abroad. And CMS wasn't the only or the first missionary society. In 1795, you had the Baptist Missionary Society. And in 1795, one of my heroes, Morgan John Rhys, published 5 issues of y Cylchgrawn Cymraeg, the first Welsh journal, and each issue included a report of the success of the foreign mission. In 1793, for instance, and 1795, the London Missionary Society were formed, and then 1799, the CMS. And then you had individuals such as John Evans, a student from the Carmarthen Academy, a congregationalist going to the Cape of Good Hope. And you had David Jones and Thomas Bevan, again congregational, leaving Llwyd to go to Madagascar in 1818. And David Griffiths joined them in 1821. So this was the activity which happened in mission in Wales. But what was behind all this? I'm not saying that this is the only thing behind. It was a millennial or Puritan hope. One thing that drove the missionary was a post-millennialism, if you like. Simply the hope, the Puritan hope. This theology dominated the missionary movement. It is to be seen in the work of Pantycelyn and the letters between Pantycelyn and Harris. If you read publications from this period which report on missionary work, it encourages the churches to support missionary work. They're full of millennialism, dialogue and a hope of millennial hope, of a Puritan hope. What do I mean by this? If you millenarianism is a Christian teaching which teaches that the 1,000-year reign, the millennium of heavenly blessing, is to be experienced before the end of time. Hand in hand with this, there is the belief in the second coming of Christ. The pre-millennial feel that you should expect this after the second coming. Post-millennials expect this before the second coming. And as eschatological literature relating to the last things, this arises in exciting times and bad times, leading to basic changes in society. For instance, wars, famine, or a religious revival, as was seen in Wales through the Methodist revival. So if you read the books, letters, pamphlets, articles and journals of this period, you mention the downfall of the Antichrist, the binding of Satan, the conversion of the Jews, and the millennium. Things that are prophesied in Revelations chapter 20, which is to be seen before the second coming of Christ. Sometimes the authors would even try to work out exactly to the exact year the second coming should be expected, as Morgan Llwyd, the Puritan, tried to do this in his poems in the 1630s. And as Denzil Morgan explains in his second volume of Theological Comprehensive, the signs of the times led the Christians of Wales to hope to see international success of the gospel. The gospel succeeded in an unprecedented manner. The preaching was effective, and people wanted biblical knowledge. Bibles were easily available. Sunday schools were full, and the prayers of the Welsh were in earnest. Another influence by this period were these, and I'm going to mention a little about evangelicalism, but also was the Enlightenment and political radicalism. And very often, these three things are written about as rivals or things that cannot work in concord, but I'm not so sure about that. Evangelism stresses emotion and personal experience, while the Enlightenment, on the other hand, lays stress on organization and reason, and perhaps the children of the Enlightenment and the revival might seem in contrast, but they do believe that a great change is afoot, the end of the world perhaps, or a totally new social order which will create heaven, spiritual or material or political, on earth. This is a period when the ideas of the Enlightenment, evangelicalism, and political radicalism were afoot. They had established, in fact, by the period of the Cenhadwr Eglwysig. But as the emphasis of Enlightenment was on reason. Because of that, there was an emphasis on scientific methodology, questioning and challenging the traditional teachings of the Church. And the Enlightenment also stresses individual freedom and freedom of expression. Traditionally, evangelicalism was as an enemy of Enlightenment. I've already said that evangelical became a strong movement during the Great Awakening of the 18th century. It's a period of religious revival, firstly in the North America, under the guidance of Jonathan Edwards, and the evangelical or Methodist revival in Britain, led by Rowlands, Pantycelyn, Whitfield, and the Wesley brothers in England. And this is characterized by emotion and personal religious experience. And the historian David Bebbington stresses that for the four main stresses of evangelicalism, first of all, conversionism, secondly, biblicism, the crucicentrism, and lastly, he puts it as conversionism, biblicism, crucicentrism, and activism. And together they form a quadrilateral of priorities that is the basis of evangelicalism. And I will, I'm not going to explain these, and because of, but just to say, as regards radicalism, a political radicalism is the idea of overturning the social and values of the time, such as the Crown. There was the American War of Independence during this period, and overturning the structures of the Church and Parliament, and structures such as these. The most obviously was the slave trade through revolutionary means. What about the Cenhadwr Eglwysig, the journal itself? What's interesting is that we see the evangelicalism, Enlightenment, and radicalism. This journal incorporating these three things, emphasizing what I believe and what people like Wyn James have written about, that the Enlightenment and evangelicalism and radicalism weren't necessarily contradictory. There were individuals, pamphlets, volumes, and journals which incorporate the three elements. And I think a Cenhadwr Eglwysig was one of them. So a Cenhadwr Eglwysig I'm not going to go through each and every issue. The time would not be on our side, but they are available to read on the Cylchgronau Cymru web of the National Library, an excellent resource. But I'm just going to highlight the occasional thing here. The first issue, June 1853. Why publish such a journal? The main aim will be to inspire missionary zeal amongst the nation of Wales and waken them to their duties as regards paganism. Well, this is evangelicalism, the missionary zeal to spread the gospel of Christianity. We intend, as we go forward, to take a general view on the different countries of the earth. And therefore, we can at times within this circle, not only their practices and moral characteristics, but also their historic, well, this is the Enlightenment. The stress on learning, reason, understanding the world as it is. There's no fear of the Enlightenment here, no fear of new cultures. The great stress of this journal is, yes, missionary zeal, but also to teach, to educate, and how to do this as regards language. Our attempt to make it clear to the people. The date, this was only a few years after the treason of the Blue Books. It's interesting that there's this emphasis on publishing in Welsh in order to teach and educate the Welsh people. But, my Christian friends, our aim is higher than making a small contribution to missionary literature, to bring Wales to a feeling of its commitment to God and its fellow nations. Can we look at our congregations going to the house of God on a quiet Sabbath and listening to the song and praise of the best without thinking of the dark practices of the pagan countries? Can Wales, which always is prominent in revivals, look without concern on this? Again, the link between success at home and the desire to succeed abroad. Well, and all the issues are full of pictures, and this is the first one, a map of the world. You can see the countries which are not coloured. Those are the good Protestant countries: Britain, Scandinavia, parts of North America. And then you have centres on the west coast of Africa, South Africa, then Madagascar. The Congregationalists have arrived there, Australia, and the north of New Zealand, and also centres in India and China. Of course, Europe is a sort of grey area. Catholics. No comment there from the General Secretary of Cynan. But about New Zealand, before this, they fed on potatoes, fish, and occasionally human flesh, because we have plenty of evidence that they were a nation of cannibals or man-eaters. And all numbers, the issues includes knowledge about the information about the countries that good Western Christians reached. The intention is to educate, but you can't ignore the imperialist slant, which arises from time to time. And in this paragraph, if there was cannibalism in New Zealand, but the picture that the Cenhadwr Eglwysig gives of the natives of all countries isn't always a very positive picture, if I may put it that way. And then, of course, there's mention of the slave trade. And the author in issue number 11, which the emphasis on Africa, who can comprehend half the misery, the injustice, and the cruelty that the slaves have to endure? And doesn't God find the pity of Africa? And does he not hear the cries of those who pray for deliverance? Is there not one who consider all the oppression under the sun and who will listen to the plea of the oppressed? No, he did not draw back his arms so that they could not save. He will smash the chains of the oppressor. There's a very radical stress here when they mention slavery. He will smash the chains of the oppressor. There's a shade of the Magnificat here in the Gospel of Luke. Now, there's the room here to compare how the Cenhadwr Eglwysig discusses slavery and how Morgan John Rhys Cylchgron Cymraeg does it. He was much more radical, but that, of course, was 15 years before this. And this campaign against slavery was much more mainstream and more acceptable, if you like, by now. That could mean that this sort of language is not so radical. But there's a mixture here of evangelical zeal and radical politics, and also the Enlightenment. I noticed that time is going on. I'm sorry about that. Now, what's being developed here is some sort of creative writing. There are poems, and also there's a sort of short stories which portrays a Sunday school with a script, a drama between the teacher, the vicar, and the pupils. I'll just read some of the dialogue, and it focuses on slavery. The vicar says, and I won't give a vicar's voice, not only that the name within the bounds of the command to preach the gospel to all creatures, but apart from that, we have a particular debt to the sons of Africa on behalf, because of this vile slave trade, which they have suffered for centuries. And David Bach says, we heard a lot about it, sir, but it is difficult for us as Welsh to understand what is meant by the trade in slaves. And the vicar says, the vicar goes on to explain, this is a trade where a host of Europeans and cruel and unfeeling Americans expressed Alltud, the Western African coast, and reward the chiefs of those tribes to sell them, men, women, and children. And then there's that element of teaching. And then Aneirin is worried about this. But how could the Christian governments of Europe and America could bear such shameful trade? And the vicar says, yes, indeed. How indeed? But what do you say when you hear that for 2 centuries, not only tolerate tolerated, but approved it insofar as the law was passed in the Parliament. Yes, the English Parliament organised the number of slaves that could be transferred from Africa in different ships. And Aneurin says, well, that would be unbelievable unless you had told us that one nation such as ours and the Bible in their hand could ever be guilty of such a shameful sin. How dreadful when we think of the command of our Saviour, whatever you would wish the men to do to you, do you unto them. Well, yes, Aneurin, from the mouths of babes and sucklings. And the vicar goes on, Adla, it is a trade which has steered on human blood. And the journals are full of pictures and showing various nations, how they worship, how they eat, how they dress, and so on. But to finish very quickly, and I'm sorry for taking your time, the lessons, or perhaps not lessons, but some points that come to mind when studying the Cenhadwr Eglwysig. It's the value of knowledge in an age where there wasn't much information. They lived in a period where the truth is not being accepted, that misinformation is particularly on the social media of the time. But our forefathers and foremothers knew the value of knowledge, and information was not something to be scared of. Being open to new cultures, new religions or different religions wasn't something to be afraid of, but something to empower and enrich our personal experience. So the value of knowledge in an age of misinformation and lack of information. And what's interesting is the use of the term evangelical and evangelicals in America these days, and very often they're linked with Trump and an age of misinformation. But it's important to remember, when we throw about terms such as evangelical and evangelicals around, make sure that we know the exact meaning of these words. I belong to the evangelical tradition, and I'm not afraid to say that. I'm proud to be able to say that. But the tradition, my tradition, is the tradition of Morgan John Rhys, Pantycelyn, and the Cenhadwr Eglwysig. Our forefathers and foremothers saw that smashing down injustice was not something niche for the church, but it was part of the church's mission. And one thing I noticed when I carried out this work, that Wales now is the mission field. So many of these countries to which the CMS went, so many of these countries now are sending missionaries to Wales. And that's a comment to finish, by the way. And thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. It's been a very wide-ranging session, historically and theologically. There is an opportunity, if anybody wants to ask a question. I can't see anything. If you want to raise your hand, your physical hand, or your virtual hand, on Zoom, you're welcome to ask any questions. We can, I can see Denzil Morgan. Do you want to ask a question? Denzil, please. Thank you, Cynan. Excellent. Thanks for enlightening me. about a journal which I have not read. I must confess. Several things that arise. The Cylchgrawn started in was first published in 1853, but the society was established 50 years before that. Is there a reason for the delay before publication? No idea, Denzil. I'm sorry. One of the things I thought about with this morning, was it a sort of reaction to the response perhaps to the treason of the Blue Books? Could have been. Another thing following on from that, what was the name of the editor? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Edmund Jones. His name was Edmund Jones. He was rector of Llanarmon, Mynydd Mawr, in the parish of Llanrhaeadr y Mochnant. But more information than that I do not have. Did you notice that there were particular authors cropping up time and time again in the journal? No.
Okay, right.
And mostly it was there were just stories from the missionary field, named a lot of leaders amongst the natives and the captains and people like those, but no, not authors as such. There was no sort of academic tint to the articles. It was quite popularly aimed. And was there any mention of Anglican, the Welsh Anglican missionaries who'd gone to the mission field? Not as far as I know, but don't take my word for it. I must admit that I haven't read every word of every issue. Thank you. But who would have been out in the mission field during that period, would you know? Amongst the Welsh Anglicans. I'm sure there were some, but I don't know. This is a new field in a way. And that's one of the reasons for this series, to remind us that the Anglicans have a contribution as well.
History is written by the victors.
History is written by the victors. It's the non-conformists who've cornered the market. But one thing I have discovered is no, the Anglicans were equally enthusiastic. But and I'm sure that there were missionaries, but I am not sure who they were. Definitely, yes, it's something to... It's the subject of another lecture. I think Wyn could answer that. Well, I'm not going to say exactly which who the missionaries were, but there were some. But of course, they were a minority compared with the Congregationists and Methodists and so on. They weren't so prominent as in number. Well, two things I'd say. We must remember that we're talking about this gap of 50 years between the establishment and the publication of the magazine itself. Of course, the growth of publication was slow in a way in the very early period, or generally. I mean, it takes time for all the whole organization, the journals to start up. Another factor perhaps is something I touched upon in the last seminar, the fact that the 50s was a period of evangelical regeneration within the established church itself. That might feed the missionary zeal. And the third thing I want to emphasize, when you mention that it was full of stories and so on, anonymously in a way, with many pictures and so on. And as you've noticed, that some of them had the English wording. There was quite a lot of, may I call it, borrowing from English or translation from English sources and taking the blocks, the print blocks from English publications. That was true about the nonconformists, but it would be interesting to look at the similar English publications of the Society to see how much the Cenhadwr Eglwysig cannibalized English language material. Cannibalizing, yes, 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 rather an unfortunate term. But it does raise another question, of course, which I mentioned but haven't developed it. The imperialist attitudes and to what degree they steered that, and to what degree was that steered by, if I'm right in arguing that these sources were English, were in English, they were adapted into Welsh or translated. To what degree did that steer their viewpoint and standpoints? And of course, generally, the church people tended to be more conservative and British in their mentality. You're thinking of somebody such as Michael D. Jones, who would be totally against imperialism. But the Anglicans were not so strongly against this. Well, these themes will continue today. Imperialism and evangelicalism and all bound up with that on both sides of the Atlantic. I think we need to end this session, but I just want to make one comment before we have a break. You raised the question whether any mission came from Wales with the CMS. Well, my wife went from the CMS. Not in that period in question, but in the 90s, to Pakistan. And one of her chief friends, who was there with the CMS, was a young lady from the South Island of New Zealand. So I can assure you that the Christian gospel and the influence of CMS reached South Island, New Zealand. We've had an excellent session and we look forward to the second session in a short time. So I will just give you about 5 minutes. So come back just before 5 to 11. Welcome back. I hope you've had a break. It's good to reconvene, and particularly good to welcome Alun Jones to us as our second speaker. Alun comes from Trevor in Arfon and lives close to Cenhadwr and has done so since 1976. Near the village of Cenhadwr, married to Anne and father to 5 sons and grandfather to grandchildren. He established the famous shop Llwyd and Pwllheli in the year 1970, and I can witness to the value of that shop, that particular shop, when I was the vicar of Pwllheli at the turn of the century. And it's still there, of course, and a very important shop and a treasury. He kept the shop for about 40 years and 4 days. That's a record, and very detailed. And after that period, transferred it to his son. Alun has published 11 novels. The last, Llwyd Gwyn yr Adar, appeared very recently in December of last year. He was the winner of the Daniel Llwyd Memorial Prize in the National Eisteddfod with his first novel, Ac yna clywodd sŵn y môr, in the year 1978. And is the editor of a casglwr, the Journal of Cymdeithas Bob Owens in 2005, and one of the editors of the local community newspaper, Llyn. And he's now going to talk about the work and life and influence of Robert Isaac Jones, more familiar perhaps as Alltud Eifion. We are very pleased to be able to welcome you here, Alun, and look forward very much to your contribution. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation to contribute to this particular series. He was a devotional churchman and a strong conservative. That's a sentence from the tribute following the death of Alltud Eifion on March the 7th. He was the oldest poet in Wales. He was the author of many books and had edited the Brython, went on to say. And indeed, he was a convinced member of the church, as he mentioned in 16 verses of a poem that he wrote about Rhyfel gwrth Eglwysig, the war against the church. But there's much more to that, to Robert Isaac Jones. He was born on the 25th of June 1814 at Llwyd, and Trefellyn, about 3 miles from Cenhadwr to the Criceth direction, the son of Gaynor and Owen Jones. The father was the son of the brother of Robert Jones Roslan, the author of Drych yr Amseroedd. Robert was the second of 6 children, all boys, 3 of whom died young. But the familial connection from this mother's side with the family of Dr. Robert Roberts of Isall Fawr in Llanby Hangel y Pennant, a family of well-known doctors. And possibly that's why Robert, when he was 16 years age, as an apprentice to the chemist David Williams in Pwllheli. By the famous Beaumaris Eisteddfod from 2 years later in 1832, the Eisteddfod of Princess Victoria, he was a well-known poet to be received at 18 years of age into the Gorsedd of Bards, where he was given the name Alltud Eifion. He then spent periods at Caernarfon and London. But by 1838, when he was 24 years old, he'd established a business in Cenhadwr Square, and Cenhadwr, at that time, was a much more important town than Porthmadog. The name of the new business on the ground floor of the Market Hall on the Bergellet side was the Cambrian Pill Depot, which took advantage of the pills and potions and lotions, which increased in popularity and was a remedy for almost all ills. The main ingredient was simple psychology, I would think. And Robert took great advantage of marketing and advertising these miraculous cures was as important as producing them. No family should be without them. There were branches of the business in Porthmadog and Festiniog, and Alltud Eifion was still at it over 50 years later, to the end of his life. He was raised a Methodist, and there's no certainty when he turned to the church. this has been suggested that it happened fairly early, but in a letter in 1836, he calls the priests as black coats, since he thought that they'd influenced Lord Newborough when he refused to release land for a new Methodist chapel in Pwllheli. But whatever happened to make him turn his back on the Methodist, it's difficult to accept another Robert Roberts when he says in his autobiography, A Wandering Scholar, that there'd been a vast argument in a meeting which went against the Alltud, and that he therefore left the Methodist and became a churchman with the headstrong zeal of a convert who hated the people he had left with more than the convert's hatred. If that's true, and there's plenty of evidence to prove that this hatred didn't last, certainly the Alltud embraced the church with his whole soul and heart when he joined it. It could be said that he embraced the Conservative Party, which came into being in 1834, equally enthusiastically. The Reverend Robert Roberts, who was a curate of Cenhadwr Church when the Alltud died, and gave a memorial sermon about him following the burial. He mentions in 1907 in the Geninen that the Alltud tended towards the Low Church party as regards viewpoint. Certainly, he believed that the main work of the church was to attract, serve, and convince as many as possible people, particularly since nonconformity was increasing. Other sources suggest that he places him in the Oxford movement and the High Church, believing in a formal service and adhering to the Catholic traditions of the Church, emphasizing the authority of the sacraments and ritual and the final authority of the bishops. Many of the clerics in the Bangor diocese in this period supported the Oxford movement, such as Nicander, the Reverend Morris Williams, who was rector of Llanrhydlan, but as Alltud, born in Eifionydd. But unlike his friend Nicander, Alltud Eifion was firmly convinced that all bishops in Wales should be able to speak Welsh. It's possible also that the enthusiasm of people such as Nicander attracted the Alltud into the Oxford movement rather than the exact principles of the movement itself, and that by the time of the Robert R. Roberts was the opinion that the church was important than any ideology of it. His dedication to the church was tireless. Before erecting St Mary's in Cenhadwr, work which lasted from 1806 until 1811, the only church in the parish was the Church of St Cenhadwr in Ynys Cenhadwr, an isolated building some 3/4 of a mile to the south of Pentrefellin, and with no house or farm or anything near it. He was very faithful to that church, as well as to Cenhadwr Church. He was church warden from 1843 until 1864. He was so enthusiastic and his conviction that he, together with John Thomas of Porthmadog, born from Cenhadwr and who came to Porthmadog in 1850 to work as a shipping clerk, they were mostly responsible for establishing a church in Porthmadog, and that's how St. John's in the town came into existence. The Alltud was very much aware that the nonconformists were very willing to erect new chapels, and by the time church services were being held in the National School in Porthmadog, 5 denominations had already established services in brand new chapels. St. John's Church, the building began in 1873 and it was consecrated on May the 4th, 1876. However, years before that, the Alltud had established a Sunday school in Cenhadwr in 1842, the first church Sunday school in the deanery of Eifion. This was 2 years after the death of Elizabeth, his first wife, who died in 1840 at 28 years of age, a month after the death of their baby, Owen Hughes, who died at 3 months old in January. It's obvious the school was a success, so much so that it said that some nonconformists complained against it. And it's doubtless that he had a central part in organising Cenhadwr Church better and attracting Welsh services. This was more important than ever, since nonconformity in all its aspects was gaining strength, and essentials such as the tithe were beginning to be attacked, and even the mad idea of disestablishing the church was being discussed more and more. As regards his work, the miraculous medicines didn't take all his attention. As well as being a poet, forgotten by now, although one hymn of his own, Rhoi'n Gofio Anga Iese, is in Emynau Llan and in Cenhadwr Ffydd. He was also an author and contributed regularly to papers and magazines, particularly on antiquarianism, because he became a printer and publisher himself. He established the press in 1854 next to his chemist shop. Some of the books published are Gwaith Barddonol Siôn Wyn o Eifion in 1861, that is John Thomas of Chwilog, the bedridden poet, the biggest hypochondriac of the 19th and 19th century. Cif Beino by Eben Bardd in 1863, and Cell Meidwy, Ellis Owen Cefn y Meysydd in 1877. Ellis Owen was a bit of a hero for him, and who also taught him his craft, as he did to a number of other poets in the area. A brief memoir by the Alltud at the beginning of the book is full of admiration, an admiration that does not fade when he noted that Ellis Owen, who was Judge Warden in Cenhadwr for years, had cast his lot with the Calvinistic Methodists in the Bryn Melyn, where his mother had been a member. It's likely that the last title to be published by the press while he was still alive was Atgofion Ieuenctid, the Reverend George Salt Llanfrothen, who became later Vicar of Bodleian in Llyn, where he is said to have said, "You are the salt of the earth. I am salt of Bodleian." This was published in 1904. And the press continued under the name of Robert Isaac Jones and Son for some years after his death in 1905. With his son, Edward Christmas, ran it and moved to Snowdon Street in Porthmadog. As regards his own books, the Gestiana, the history of Tre'r Gest, was his main work as an author. This was published in 1892, and a new, it was published by T.R. Graig in 1975 to coincide with the National Eisteddfod in Criceth in that year. One of the most prominent features of the author is central, his passion for history, particularly local history, antiquarianism. He followed the tradition of many of the old literary parsons. During this period, he had married his second wife, Martha, and buried 4 of their children. Martha died on the 26th of March, 1875, 52 years of age. And 4 years later, the Alltud married Anne Jones of Hill, who was born in the parish of Trewalchmai in Anglesey. On Friday, June the 25th, 1858, Robert started on his greatest adventure of his life as a publisher. This is the day the first issue of Y Brython came from the press, costing 2p. This was a weekly newspaper, was the intention, and it presented viewpoints clearly. It is not with a radical eye that the Brython seeks, and not with a radical hand it will act, and it will not lend its ear to the anti-church fancies, but it will argue with a brave and fearless voice for our state and church institutions. This was a 16-page magazine, and it obviously wasn't meant to be a local paper, although the first issues have some local news and the occasional local article, such as Moel Gest in the proposed series of Regions of Wales. The first issue was quite similar to what was in Banner Cymru, with articles, home and foreign news, an editorial discussing foreign politics, markets, train timetables, a bardic column, correspondence, and births, marriages and deaths. And certainly that column wasn't limited to the local, and it follows the ordinary practice of that time. You never mention the mother's name, only whose wife she was. And when we have a record of a death of a child, he was always the father's child. In the third issue, one of the first signs that he wasn't going to follow the procedure which was being set by most of the other papers and journals of the time. In his Notes of the Week column, the editor defends the church tax and the tithe. An argument of this had been, a debate on this had been held in the House of Lords. The church tax is a land tax, says Alltud, and everyone within the whole kingdom is bound to obey that law. And it was a tax set on the rich for the benefit of the poor. But despite that adjudication, it was a tax to maintain the church. Locally was the church tax, although there was never enforced in statute. However, because of mainly objections from nonconformists, an act came into force in 1868 to do away with it, although it allowed parishes to maintain it on a voluntary basis. The tithe, of course, was much more serious and oppressed the poor to a much greater degree, as the histories of the tithe wars in Wales shows. But it had another feature, and that again was more serious. It wasn't enforced by statute that the local churches would benefit from it. For instance, in this comprehensive report on Carnarvonshire, a description of Carnarvonshire in 1809-1811, Edmund Hyde Hall, when he takes us to Abergaron Church, mentions how the tithe was spent. About half of it goes to Mrs. Finch, the mistress of the Foelas estate, Pentre Foelas, and the estate of Cefnamwr, Tidwaliog. 40% goes to St. John's College, Cambridge, an education institution which wasn't short of a bob or two, and 10% goes to maintain the rector. However, as the weeks and months went in the history of the Brython, it's obvious that everything returning the weekly issue becomes all the writing, setting, distributing, and all the other difficulties. And probably the sales weren't as high as was hoped. The 15th issue, October the 1st, was the last weekly issue, and from November on, it came out every month. Soon afterward, Daniel Sylvan Evans, who was at the time a curate in Llangian, became an editor, and he stayed there until 1860, when Eifion himself became editor. The journal adhered strongly to the principle of not including religious debates of any kind, but he didn't mind publishing other arguments. There is some strange urge in who are called poets in Wales to produce doggrel on all subjects except poetic subjects, sent Llwyd Deuog of Odredd Foel in a letter in 1859. Oh, poets, please leave alone women to bear plant, lovers to marry, and to dyddi, and men to die without having to produce englynion. This sort of letter certainly contributed to the variety of the Brython. It wasn't a monotonous journal, and it didn't stick to one subject. It was became smaller in 1860, and the price was raised to sixpence. And they carried on to 1861. But there was a break in 1862 is significant, and it came to an end after 4 quarterly issues published in 1863. And the Alltud recognised that it had been a financial loss, but a success in all other respects. And he had quite a firm foundation to believe this, because the Brython was as good as anything else published at the time. Obviously, the Brython of all the work of the Alltud was his favourite child. And in 1901, a second edition of the first two editions appeared, with a selection of the main articles of the original issues. The Alltud was central to another journal also, and an association formed by lay people within the church, the Church Lay Society, whose main aims was to promote the principles of the Oxford movement and supporting those clerics who supported the movement. It was established in 1852 and continued for about 6 years. Its most important production was a new journal, Banner y Groes. The first issue came out in 1854, a 12-page journal costing 1 penny. The Alltud had nothing to do directly with the journal at the beginning. The editor was Eifion, the Reverend John Williams. He was strict in praising the church and its rituals, and wanted to do away with all sort of heresy, Wesleyan heresies, and the end of nonconformism. But nonconformity had learned how to hit back, and its opinion of the Oxford movement had been expressed, was being said. The stress of that the Oxford movement was a return to papacy, and within the church that had been expressed by many low church people within the church. The second issue of Banner y Groes mentioned the Crimean War. Boys of Wales, come out to insist your brothers. Register under the banners of your country. Don't listen to the nonconformist cowards, those who will keep you entrapped by the enemy, their reasons against the war. Hide only their cowardice. Dear boys, enlist and go to the Crimea, the land of your forefathers, where Llwyd dwelt before their journeying to the Isle of Britain. Go there and free the place, or let your bodies mix with the dust of your ancestors. Well, the Office of the Cymro in Holywell published the first issues of Banner y Groes, but because of difficulties, which are not mentioned, it was after Eifion's office in Cenhadwr with the publisher, the printers, in a year's time. The price remained at a penny until the beginning of 1858, when it came to a penny halfpenny, but it ended soon afterwards. But in January 1870, it revived under the care and editorship of Alltud Eifion. The address in the first issue was to have the voice of the established church to be heard clearly once again in Wales, after the Hael described, the journal called Yr Hael, that is, was clouded of many times. recently through the unhappy divisions as have characterised the present century in Wales. The journal defended clearly and set out church principles without insulting no one. We trust that we get the support that we deserve. And although the church had let the Welsh press go and have introduced anti-church poison into their minds, it's better to act sooner than later. The aim was to bring everyone back to the same fold and the same shepherd. It was a 32-page journal, cost a penny halfpenny. In the February 1830 issue, the editor says that the circulation was far better than expected, and the price could be reduced to a penny after this year. The contents was expected: articles, the story, some for children, advice, poetry, puzzles, and correspondence, including one letter condemning those who arrived late to the church, saying that the last pages of the Book of Common Prayer would be enough for them. But and then a letter condemning the church for not supporting the Sunday school. And it's because it was such a good influence. But whatever these standpoints, the journal was not boring and quite unlike the first series under the editorship of Eifion, but emphasizing the beliefs of the Oxford movement wasn't central either. It carried on until the end of 1873, and the Alltud at the beginning of the bound volume of that beginning sounds rather sad. It might be of no good saying how much we have been disappointed in the support we received as contributions and the dissemination of the magazine. This, together with the financial loss every year, caused me great distress. And then Banner y Groes came to an end. This did not affect the church principles of Alltud Eifion. He also did his best promoting Cenhadwr, as well as being central in public affairs, in so much so that Johan Madog, John Williams of Cenhadwr, called him unauthoritarian. In 1854, he established a public reading room in Cenhadwr, and although he objected to the idea of creating school boards, mainly because he believed that there would be no room for the Bible in them, he became a prominent member of the local board when that was established. And he was also a firm supporter of the Eisteddfod, right until the end. And he attended all national Eisteddfod in the north and some in the south as well. And all of the big Eisteddfodau held in the north between 1869 and 1879. He was responsible for attracting the Eisteddfod to Cenhadwr in 1872, as well as the Eisteddfodau held there in 1851 and 1877. And in all the Eisteddfodau he attended, he would address the winning poetry in the chairing ceremony with an englyn or englyn. The Alltud was attending Eisteddfodau in the period where there was much growth in the Eisteddfod and also a lot of Anglicisation of this institution. He drew up the list of subjects for the Dyffryn Madog Eisteddfod in 1877, a list which was in English, possibly suggesting that he also accepted the Anglicisation without giving this much thought. Later, lazy prejudices, which would say that the church and political conservatism were equally anglicized, would possibly support this. But we can hope that fact would be stronger than prejudice, and it wouldn't be foolish to suggest that the Alltud's enthusiasm for the Welsh language and the idea of Welshness more or less bankrupted him. According to the warm-hearted tribute in the Herald Gymraeg, when he died on March the 7th, 1905, the Alltud was in his favourite church, the town church, that is St Mary's Church, a week before the previous Sunday, taking part in the service as was his practice. Two of his sons survived him, Henry Isaac, born in 1844, and Edward Christmas, born in 1857. Henry became a doctor in the United States of America, and Edward got his father's business as well as the debts, and that's probably why Edward Christmas probably became a bankrupt in 1908 in Cenhadwr. The Alltud Eifion was buried with his second wife, Martha, which also was the grave of 3 of his children in Cenhadwr, in the same graveyard as many of the famous men of the area, such as David y Garreg Wen and Eglwysig Owen, Kevin Macy. In the memorial service in Cenhadwr the following day, there was one in the evening in Cenhadwr Church. And the second service, the Reverend J. Williams preached, and it was through his leadership that a window was set in memory in Cenhadwr in 1906. His wish to have memorial service and a hymn by him, Goleini yn yr Hwyr, would be sung in both. And in that twilight between two worlds, his light will always shine, and the light that shone on Calvary will light this path of mine. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Alun. We really enjoyed that presentation. I knew very little about Alltud Eifion, apart from the hymn Oem Gofio Angau Iesu. So it's good to have a more complete picture of his work in the community as a poet and as one who promoted all sorts of activity in the area and beyond in Wales. May I ask a quick question? I referred some time ago to the hymn, Rwy'n Gofio Angau Iesu, that's in Caneuon Ffydd and in Ymynar Eglwys. I would think that's a hymn for communion. And it's a hymn which had a tendency towards the Catholic side of the church. You referred already to the influence of the Oxford movement, and did he belong to that movement or not, or supported it? Certainly, I would think that the theme of that hymn would suggest so. May I ask, are there other verses, unpublished perhaps, not published in the, because I vaguely remember singing that hymn. It had about 5 verses, perhaps some have been added by other authors, I don't know. Yes, there are. He published a booklet of about 4 pages of his own poems and hymns. And of course the poem Yr Rhyfel Gwrth Eglwysig. That isn't a hymn, of course. But there are 4 verses to that hymn. And there was sung. But there are the hymns of his composition in the booklet. Right. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr gwybod.
Have they been published wide in any? Not as far as I know, not in any hymn book. Only the one. I see. Interesting.
Diddorol iawn.
Well, excellent. And thank you, Alun. And thank you, Cynan, also. We've had a very interesting morning. We started with the whole world, looking at the activity of the CMS and its magazine. And we look across the world, and that zeal for evangelization and sharing information about the gospel, but not also, but the knowledge of the heart as well. And it opens all sorts of questions, I think, in the coming session, in the more informal session, in the sense that the evangelical church wishes to make new disciples. I'm sure we'll be discussing that. And then you, Alun, in this session have taken us to consider the interesting character and in his activity in the community as poet, publisher, and a hymn writer. And it's been wonderful to have a glimpse of the character of Eifion. And again, in both sessions, we've had seen how the church in that period, I would nearly said disestablished, but they were split into different traditions between the evangelicals, those who supported the Oxford movement, and the emphasis on scripture and personal conversion. On the other hand, the stress on the sacraments and the rituals of the church, and questions also arising, of course, about the disestablishment and the idea of being a state church. A session we'll hear much more about that in coming sessions, as the history comes to an end in a way in 1920 with the disestablishment, but there'll be a lot of sessions before that. But it's interesting to see the beginning of that path. Thank you both very much. We're most grateful to you for being with us this morning, for sharing your scholarship. And we look forward now. We finish recording soon, and then there will be an informal session and an opportunity to examine some of these themes. But for the time being, thank you very much. And may I remind you that the next session of Gofal Gwynllan will be on Saturday, the 15th of February, in about 3 weeks' time. And Angharad will send you out details of that session soon so that you can register and encourage others to join us. For the time being, with thanks for our speakers, let us finish this session and turn to the informal Paned a Chlonc session. Thank you all. And thank the translator. Yn cyfieithu yn ffyddlon i ni yn ystod y sesiwn yma. Ni'n ddiolchgar iawn.